I said that they were trash. Well, the name is Crass, not Clash. They can stuff their punk credentials because it's them that take the cash. Crass were/are the punkest punk band in existence, to the point where they were that worried about being predictably punk by punks that they did the most unpunk thing, decide to not be punk, and that was the punkest thing they could do. Let's have a quick recap, even though everyone who has clicked on this video probably know who Crass are. If you want to jump ahead to me ranking the albums from worst to best, feel free using the chapters below. Crass were a Cockney punk band formed in 1977 who went on to become the undisputed inventors of the subgenre Anarcho punk. They're a bit of a Marmite band, but regardless of whether you love them or hate them, no one can deny that they are one of the most unique bands to ever exist. With 10 members, not all of which contribute with instruments, this gives them a legacy more of a collective who also lived in the same house. Completely disillusioned by what punk had become, major labels promoting the likes of the Sex Pistols and the Clash, Crass were the first band to truly embody punk's DIY ethos, starting their own label and making everything they did affordable, printing "Pay No More Than" stickers on all of their albums. They vowed to playing gigs in the middle of nowhere in the most obscure venues to reach as many people as they could, something that's lost its gravitas in a post-internet world. There are thousands of imitators, but only one Crass. Crass released 5 albums on their own label, Crass Records: Feeding of the 5000, Stations of the Crass, Envy, Christ the Album, and Yes Sir I Will between 1978 and 1983 before breaking up in 1984. A year and a half later they headed back into the studio and recorded one more album, 10 Notes on a Summer's Day, in 1986. This rounded up the number of Crass albums ranked in this list to 6. They also released a compilation made up of singles and oddities called Best Before 1984. It's good. I didn't want to review that one as well because I was a bit crassed out towards the end of making this video. It's also worth noting that I didn't bother with all the extra live stuff that came with Christ the Album and Stations of the Crass. This list is based on all the studio stuff only. I find it weird that you give away a load of live stuff like that. I mean, it makes sense on a reissue, but the actual album? Nah, that's not for me. Right, that's enough of an intro. You know why you're here. Time to rank every Crass album from worst to best. Like and subscribe for more videos like this. Crass's 5th album, 1983's Yes Sir I Will, is not only the worst Crass album by some distance, but one of the worst punk albums I've ever heard. In fact, let's take away the word punk. I can't remember hearing a worse album of any genre, maybe because I forced myself to listen from beginning to end for the sake of the review. Yes Sir I Will was a rushed and panicked album by the band. They were annoyed at themselves for not mentioning the Falklands War on their previous album, 1982's Christ the Album, so much so that they wanted to address the conflict as soon as possible. There was no time for really composing anything, so they just recorded what is billed as one long 44-minute song that sounds improvised. It's 7 musicians playing 7 different songs simultaneously, all in different keys without considering mix and balance or music theory, and the mood they've been told to capture is just fueled up primitive rage and nothing else, making it torture to listen to. Vocalists Steve Ignorant and Eve Libertine just scream at you with no let-up, whilst the guitars and drums just make loads of overbearing noises. I did feel a bit sorry for bassist Pete Wright because I get the feeling he was actually attempting to make some coherent music from time to time, but the drums and guitars weren't playing ball, refusing to bounce off any riff that he was providing, so he just gave up. Crass's guitarists have never played like Jimi Hendrix, but here it is just a sludge of overbearing, random atonal angriness with no let-up for pretty much all of the album. The one long song concept was abandoned for the CD and they were split up and given song names. Track 2's piano ballad, Anarchy is Just Another Word, is a nice oral break from the pure noise, but even that is a really cheesy 80s piano synth ballad, which is good for Crass to attempt, but it isn't a strong song. If that was a song by any other band, I wouldn't like it. The worst thing about it is it lures you into a false sense of security that this will be an album with lots of varied musical exploration, when in fact the only exploration was overbearing, unstructured anger. One saving grace of Yes Sir I Will was the 2-minute blast 5-knuckle shuffle that felt like it would have fit right at home on Feeding of the 5000. In its album context, it feels like Crass being satirical about their early catalogue, which is ironically the highlight of this abysmal album. Taking away those 2 tracks, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. The last track, Taking Sides, is literally 20 minutes long. No structure, no flow, just pure ferociousness. No lulls and no sense of moving forward musically. They actually begin to sound like the religious preachers they detest. Even if what they're saying makes sense, we know war is always horrendous. Not that you can really pick out a word of it anyway, because it's mixed so badly. It's just annoying. These could be the greatest lyrics ever written, but the delivery and the backing noise is so irritating and ear-bleeding and incoherent and musically nonsensical that I don't want to listen to what they have to say, which is a mad thing for me to say because Crass have always been one of my favourite bands lyrically. The Yes Sir I Will approach feels self-serving and pretentious. The more this album goes on, the more I hate it. I'd be flabbergasted if anyone in the world likes this. Only completionists would want to own this album. At least the artwork is good, and posters and packaging is great. I'm just amazed Crass listened back to this and thought, yep, that'll do, put that out. At this point they're trying too hard to change direction. I'm not surprised they split up shortly after this because it's such a burnout to listen to. They must have been burnt out performing these songs, and it just sounds like they've completely taken the fun out of being in a band. This shouldn't have been an album. This should have been Crass trying to change the establishment directly, be that running as a political party or whatever other method Crass's imagination could come up with, and tell people what Thatcher is doing in a way that is more digestible. Becoming MPs or a political party goes against Crass's no government anarchic ideology, but more people would have engaged with what they were saying. Maybe they should have done a Chumbawamba. 1 out of 10.
What is that, if it is not grey?
In 5th place we have the semi-posthumous album 1986's 10 Notes on a Summer's Day. I wasn't very familiar with this album when I decided to do this to myself, and when reading about it I wasn't looking forward to hearing it, but I was actually pleasantly surprised with my opinion of it. I didn't hate it. For 20th century atonal avant-garde in the same vein as Stockhausen, it was really good. Unlike Yes Sir I Will, Penny Rambo in particular dedicated a lot of time to the writing. I think at least a year to structure this, and even though it's weird and not a very popular genre, it captures different moods really well. Obviously we do get the typical Crass anger, but there are lulls and it has a lot more depth to it. I was annoyed because there was one point where the guitar sounded amazing. Possibly the most impressed I've ever been with the guitar playing of Crass. It was slick, almost like a B.B. King clean bluesy jazz guitar style about them. But whilst this was happening, other instruments ruined what they were doing. People getting their own back on the guitars for their obnoxiousness on Yes Sir I Will. Thought has gone into the production. Despite it not being easy listening, the instruments are all mixed properly and have purpose. Even if you don't like the purpose, at least there's reason behind it and the musical risks make sense. It's adventurous and unique in a much healthy way. You can tell Bjork has listened to this with the Crass connections and been influenced by all the good ideas on here and neglected the bits that don't quite work. It's evident Eve Libertine was a lot more into this than Steve Ignorant was, backed up by Steve saying in an interview that this shouldn't have been released under the Crass moniker. I would actually disagree with Steve, but maybe it shouldn't have been branded as an album. For those unsure, I think the Classical Collection box set establishes this. The instrumental side of the album would work properly as a film soundtrack. It's a B-side that could well be discussed as a masterpiece in avant-garde writing and musical conservatoires. They love that stuff in those institutions. Without the backing of a film, it's pretty tedious. Call me traditional, but it would have been nice to hear a perfect cadence at some point. I would never declare hating a whole genre of music as you're closing your mind to a whole food group when you may like something from that palette. So for avant-garde, this is good. But that doesn't change the fact it's avant-garde. This album made me think it's a shame Crass ended at this point. I think it was a good reset album to give them time to have a year or two off and go in another musical direction. As long as they didn't try too hard to not make the music people are expecting, and not to get too distracted by non-musical activities, despite what I said in the Yes Sir I Will review. It's good, but it's avant-garde. At least it's short. I would never listen to this again. 3 out of 10.
We're lost in the darkness, and set a sight of answers to the what or how.
In 4th place we have 1982's Christ the Album. I was surprised to read on Crass's Bandcamp that the album summary states, and I quote, "Christ the Album is considered by most people to be the best release in the Crass repertoire," which was odd to me because whenever I hear people talk about Crass it's always about how good the first 3 albums are, which, spoiler alert, if you've worked out, are the 3 I've left for the top 3 spot, which unlike Crass is quite predictable. I'd also read that it was their equivalent to Frankenchrist by the Dead Kennedys, which excited me because I love that album. Although the intro to Birth Control and Rock and Roll has a very eerie Dead Kennedys feel about it, that's about it. Unlike Christ the Album, Frankenchrist wasn't a really badly mixed version of similar sounding songs from their first 2 albums. The only thing they have in common is the word Christ in the title. The staple white noise guitar sounds are way too much for the rest of the instruments. Steve Ignorant's voice is so low in the mix, a lot is taken out from his impact. This is significant because on paper Crass are a band that shouldn't be good. And I know it doesn't sound like I like them, but I do honestly. Just stay till the end. The snare heavy drums and a guitarist that literally can't play, so just makes white noise sounds, shouldn't work. But Steve Ignorant's perfect Cockney snarl and well written lyrics are what make Crass so good. It's such a letdown when you can't hear him properly. Here they start to flirt with the industrial noise that ended up being overkill on Yes Sir I Will. Tracks like Buy Now, Pay As You Go just sound like Crass dropping their instruments down 93 flights of stairs. It did have its moments. The lyrics to Mother Love are subject matter they've not really touched on before, and that was interesting to hear. It would be good to hear more personal stories from the band that are apolitical and more autobiographical anecdotes from pre-Crash years. The Greatest Working Class Ripoff was a parody Oi song that was actually a great tune. Beg Your Pardon was a hit, and it was an anomaly that it was mixed properly. Rival Tribal Revel Rebel Part 2 was a great dual vocal ditty with Pete Wright at the peak of his powers. There's not much else to say about this album. I didn't absolutely detest it, nor did it have a profound effect on me. It's just there. It's a knockoff version of the first two albums with some experimentation thrown in. It's a really strange follow-up to MV2, an album made because Boot Boys thought Crass were macho, so they went feminist, and now here on Christ the Album, this is the most macho sounding album they've done. Except Sentiment. I love how weird this was, and the apathy in the intro was pretty harrowing. Maybe I need to give it another listen or two to try and get it. I've done 2 full listens now and I've still not been swayed. 4 out of 10.
They said that we were trash. Well, the name is Crass, not Clash. They can stuff their punk credentials. It's them that take the cash.
You may think throughout this video that I actually hate Crass, but these 3 albums I'm about to talk about are why I love the band so much. Crass's second album, Stations of the Crass, sounds like they were drinking a lot of protein shakes at the feeding of the 5000. It's the debut album beefed up and expanded on musically and ideologically. Crass evolved from the straight up Anarcho style from the first album here with additional offerings of dub, funk and disco. It's weird, but it's still disco as far as Crass are concerned. This is the first album we've spoken about that we have heard Crass mixed and produced properly. This is the last album Steve Ignorant's vocals sound perfect on, with tracks like Big Hands, Big Man, Big M.A.N. and Chairman of the Board, cementing Ignorant's place in history as the quintessential anarcho-punk vocalist at his violently cockney sounding best. Pete Wright also shines, not only as a growlier vocalist that complements Ignorant in the same vein as Freeman and Armstrong from Rancid, but his bass lines in the likes of Uptight Citizen and, I'm not going to get this right, Connominational Power are iconic. Musically, he's the glue that holds the band together, along with the unique drumming of Penny Rambo, more on him later. The white noise guitar effects wouldn't work without Pete Wright's fantastic bass playing. The more I listen to him, the more I start to think he has to be the most underrated bass player in the history of punk. I never hear him mentioned. He more than deserves his flowers. The beefy chords in System define this man's groovy bass playing prowess. The female vocals are rare here, but when Eve and Joy provide lead vocals on Darling and Walls respectively, they get the perfect measure of quirkiness and abstraction while still having enough structure within the songs to be able to enjoy them. Crass always said the message was more important than the music. I feel they do the music a disservice by saying that, particularly on this album and Envy. White Punks on Hope is one of my go-to tracks from any Crass album for lyrical perfection, and it's a well-crafted song to boot. Even with the Clash slander, which I think they regret to some extent, but I get why they did it, it would be the perfect song to play to someone to sum up what Crass were about: anarchy, freedom, peace and pacifism. Plus, the breakdown dub bit of the song at the end is so cool, and the guitars sound like they're actually being played by people who can play them, which isn't always the case with Crass. It's still weird and unique, but it is possibly their most accessible album to a casual fan. There's barely any songs you would want to skip, with some absolute classics in the Crass repertoire. 8 out of 10. So now we're down to 2 albums, The Feeding of the 5000 and Envy. We need a Penny Rambo drum roll for the Best Crass Album award. And the Best Crass Album goes to... Feeding of the 5000. Great job, well done. Before I wax lyrical over Feeding, let's talk about the album in at number 2. Envy. From inventing anarcho-punk to its expansion in Stations, Crass went against the grain completely on third album Envy by giving Steve Ignorant's vocal chops a rest and asking if Pete could do the same but only provide bass lines, leaving it to the girls Eve Libertine and Joy de Vivre to lead their singing. Joy de Vivre, how do I say her surname? Joy. Eve and Joy. The vocals were left to Eve and Joy. The idea was to alienate a lot of the unwanted macho bootboy fans Crass had amalgamated in the years prior, clearly not paying attention to lyrics of songs such as Big Man, Big M.A.N. and White Punks on Hope. Although I am a little disappointed we don't get Steve Ignorant on this album, the result is we get one of the greatest female-fronted punk albums ever released. Eve is gloriously quirky in a melodic phrasing and her lyrics. Just like there is only one Crass, there is only one Eve Libertine. I've read that she was a trained singer, and you can hear that not only in the tone, but the unpredictable intervals she chooses to take in her melodic lines. Her high-pitched screeching in Poison in a Pretty Pill is so satisfying. Her pitch range would cause Eve envy in every conservatoire in the country. Musically, the band sound like a harder hitting Slits and slightly softer Crass. It's hard to compare Crass with anyone else. Crass are Crass. Here we get wah-wah guitar and a good development of textures from beginning to end. This may be the best we've heard Penny Rambo play drums. His snare fills are iconic and his use of spacing lets the music breathe. I said Stations was the best album musically, but as I listen now, it's envy. There's no argument to be made. The lyrics focus heavily but not exclusively on issues surrounding women, be it the horrors of domestic violence and the monotony of family life. Whilst love can be done in the right way, and having a family and being a parent is the best thing I've ever done, it's a shame in many instances it has a level of toxicity about it. I do wonder if Eve ever found happiness in her family or motherhood. As I listened to this, I kept thinking, that's a great lyric, I need to mention that. Oh, that's another one. Oh, that's another one. Eve has a glorious way with words and is a fantastic poet. The whole album is full of imagery conveyed perfectly through clever wordplay. Systematic Death confirms Eve Libertine's face on a Mount Rushmore of best women in punk. If I had a good editor, I'd show you an image of what that would look like, with Eve next to Polystyrene, Brody Dahl, and I don't know who would be next to them. Debbie Harry, let's put her up there for now, but we might take her down. The builds in songs like Batter Motel and Where Next Columbus are progressions not many bands could pull off. Our Wedding finishes off the album as a satirical, ironic love song wrapped cleverly in a pop ballad that people none the wiser would believe was a genuine love song worthy of going to number one. When you know the truth, the descending bells at the end are absolutely terrifying. Envy is a wonderfully weird and quirky album with Crass at their best musically. There's no band like them. 8.5 out of 10. Maybe a 9, but I do miss Steve Ignorant a tiny bit. Number 1 has to be Feeding of the 5000. Not only the best Crass album, but the best Anarcho punk album, and in the top 10, maybe even top 5 punk albums of all time. I am working on a top 100 punk albums video, so subscribe and see where it ends up. Hearing this album for the first time is very much a I remember where I was when 9/11 happened type memory. I took a gamble on a Crass CD in October 2004 and listened to it on a long train journey home from visiting family in Birmingham, with my jaw wide open the whole time in awe of the uniqueness of the sound I was hearing and the distinct artwork I was taking in from the CD booklet. It's a sound I'd never heard before or since. The rawness of this recording is unmatched to the rest of their discography. Scratchy out of tune noise guitars, military snare drumming that was never a typical characteristic of punk but is plastered all over this, and the angriest, cockneyest, best vocal performance Steve Ignorant has ever put in at his youngest and snarliest. On paper it shouldn't work, but as I've said before, Pete Wright's funky octave leaping bass patterns are the secret sauce that make it so great. They didn't care if they didn't sound like anyone else, and it really paid off for them. No one was declaring punk was dead in 1978 before Sid killed Nancy. No band were writing classic songs with iconic lyrics such as The General sip Bacardi whilst the privates feel the pain, songs that were less than a minute long. The album is full of taglines like this that will go down in punk folklore, littered in songs like Banned from the Roxy, Do They Owe Us a Living, End Result, Punk is Dead. I'm trying not to overuse the words iconic and classic all the time, but that's what they are. They've Got a Bomb has the imitation of silence that follows a nuclear warhead. It's uncomfortably long, but in another way Crass were being unique and experimental while still being interesting. Then there's the Pete Wright element of the album. Securicor in particular is another Crass anthem that helps make Feeding the best and easiest Crass album to sing along to. Eve Libertine's Asylum is so blasphemous even the most hardened of atheists would wince at some of the lyrics. Crass's introduction to the world was like no other. Feeding of the 5000 is imperfect, out of tune, sloppy, yet it's flawless. The flaws make it a perfect album. And before you think I'm on some sort of nostalgia train, there are a lot of bands and albums I loved 20 years ago that don't do anything for me now. Feeding of the 5000, Crass at their angriest, genre inventing best, never to be topped. 10 out of 10. And that's the video. I've learned that I love Crass, Feeding, envy, Stations, and hate Crass. Yes sir I will, yes sir I will, yes sir I will, yes sir I will, yes sir I will. But the love 100% outweighs the hate. A great first band to do this with. What's your take on my list? Did I get it wrong? Leave your order in the comments and your favourite Crass song. Today I'm going for Banned from the Roxy. Okay, I never must. See, I know every word to that. So I'm going for Banned for the Roxy. But that might be different tomorrow if you ask me again. Thanks for getting this far into the video. I've loved doing this. I love you all. Like, share and subscribe and all that other stuff YouTubers say. See you in the next one.